It began with a whisper or rumor among the elders in Greiburg, a small village nestled on the shadowed slopes near Salzburg, Austria. They said this winter would be unlike any other. No lull in snowfall, no forgiving thaw, just relentless frost. And then the cold came earlier, deeper, and more brutal than anyone could have imagined. By mid-December of 1311, drifts rose nearly to a man's chest, and the wind screamed through the cracks in log walls like a beast on the hunt. Elric pressed his forehead to the shuttered window, feeling the chilling draft between the wood below his breath. A low fog formed on the chilly pane. The forest beyond, once vibrant, had become a ghostly thicket of silent white. He could almost hear the forest trees shivering. Beside him, his wife Amara stoked the dying embers in the hearth, stirring pottage that had simmered all day. The fragrance of root vegetables and herbs offered a small comfort, but it did little to soothe the chill gripping his bones. In the flicker of firelight, Elric's 2 children huddled together, Lena, old enough to know when fear was real, and little Corwin, who buried his face in his sister's cloak. That night, the storm seemed endless. Every gust rattled shutters and threatened to slide the heavy thatch from rooftops. Even seasoned villagers, men and women who had endured decades of winters, murmured worry under their breath. But this was more than just cold. It was something deeper, a challenge, a reckoning, a moment where nature tested everything they believed about survival. When the wind howled, it carried a message: adapt or die. Stay close, Elric whispered, wrapping his arms around his family. His tone was soft, but every syllable carried a promise. We won't let this cold end us. That vow wasn't just a father's promise, it was the spark that ignited the collective will of Greiburg. The next morning, frost coated every surface. Amara lit the hearth early. Elric stood with neighbors as they inspected roof beams and sealed gaps with clay and straw. Murmured conversations turned into instructions, then into action. Villagers moved with purpose, a single heartbeat synchronized across every home. They weren't just neighbors, they were a tribe united in defiance. And still, the cold pressed on. Supplies began to dwindle. One after another, pigs' pens fell silent, hens stopped laying, and the well froze hard beneath the ice. If winter continued this way, people would starve, children would freeze. Yet beneath that threat, something remarkable was stirring. Resilience rooted not in technology, but in intelligence, community, and hope. Greiburg's people began digging, reinforcing, sharing, innovating, transforming fear into strategy, panic into unity. This is where their story begins, not with thawed fields or the promise of spring, but with an unbreakable vow and the storm that dared them to break it. If you've ever felt powerless against a force larger than yourself, brace yourself, because what happens next will show you how ingenuity, grit, and the human heart can forge warmth out of the deadliest cold. Before we go deeper into how these medieval families outsmarted winter, smashing expectations and sparking tragedy and triumph, hit that subscribe button. It helps us create more powerful historical stories, just like this one. And if we're tackling the toughest winters from a CTUAL people in actual history, you're going to want to stick around. Quick pop quiz. What was the first action Greiburg villagers took when the deep freeze hit? A sealed cracks in their homes. With clay and straw, be burned down unused barns to collect wood for fires. Comment your answer below. Just say A or B. I'll reveal whether you're right in the next video. The first time Elric lifted a shovel that winter, it wasn't to build something. It was to save something: his family, his future, maybe even his soul. After days of bitter wind and nights so cold they could hear the wooden beams groaning, the people of Greiburg began to understand what kind of winter they were truly facing. This wasn't the kind of cold you could fight with, just thicker clothes or more firewood. This was the kind of cold that seeped into bone and memory, that stole warmth from your breath and sleep from your dreams. If they didn't outthink it, they would not outlast it. And so they turned to the one place that still offered protection, the earth itself. Generations ago, it was said the earliest settlers of Greiburg had dug their homes partway into the ground, using the natural insulation of soil to keep the warmth in and the cold out. It wasn't just practical, it was ancestral memory, and memory had never felt more like survival. With frost clinging to his eyebrows and his hands, blistered from the rough handle of a wooden spade, Elric dug. He dug through frozen clay and damp roots, deepening the floor of his cottage by 3 feet. It didn't seem like much at first, but as the days passed and more villagers joined, the transformation was undeniable. From the outside, nothing looked different. Snow still covered the rooftops, and silence still blanketed the fields. But inside those homes, beneath the thin layer of surface frost, entire rooms had been reborn. The lowered floors brought families closer to the earth's natural warmth. They lined the walls with packed mud, reinforced with layers of straw, and sealed every crevice with fresh clay. It wasn't beautiful, but it was brilliant. Elric's wife, Amara, helped line the walls with woven reed mats, creating a patchwork of texture that softened the space visually and thermally. Their children carried small bundles of hay to stuff between wall cracks. Even the smallest hands contributed to the warmth of the whole. But Elric didn't stop at the main room. He crafted a narrow chamber beneath the sleeping platform, a hidden burrow, just large enough for the family to crouch in should the hearth ever fail or the wind grow wild. He called it the Earth Womb. It wasn't a place to live, but a place to survive. Neighbors visited, inspired by the transformation. Soon, the entire village took up the task, not out of panic, but with determination. They shared tools and advice. Some men dug communal storage alcoves into the slopes beside their homes. Others constructed earthen benches, which doubled as seats and heat reservoirs. An older mason named Elric showed Elric how to layer stones for better thermal mass, stones that would soak up fire heat during the day and release it long into the night. They weren't just building, they were evolving. What amazed them most was how quickly the earth began to repay their trust. The difference inside these homes wasn't subtle. Temperatures dropped below zero outside, yet inside, beneath the ground, families could speak without seeing their breath, could sleep without fearing they'd wake as ice sculptures. It felt miraculous, and yet it wasn't magic. It was simply understanding that survival sometimes meant sinking deeper into the soil, into tradition, into humility. Children began calling their new rooms warm caves. Some drew pictures in the walls with charcoal stories of animals they imagined might live below the roots, helping them stay warm. Even the elderly, once hesitant, came to appreciate the calm, grounded warmth that the earth offered. There was something deeply spiritual about it. In a world turned white with deathly silence, the ground whispered life, and more than warmth, these underground spaces gave them something rarer: stillness. When the wind screamed through the forests, down from the Alps, and rattled every shutter, Elric's family would sit low in the earth womb, light a candle, and listen to the quiet. It reminded them they were not helpless. They were protected not by walls alone, but by the very world they lived on. In those days, no moment was wasted. If Elric wasn't digging, he was fortifying. If Amara wasn't insulating, she was stitching wall hangings to help trap heat. And when they sat together, wrapped in furs and the scent of damp earth, they spoke in whispers, not because they feared the cold might hear, but because they knew they had finally found something sacred in their stillness. That winter, the cold didn't disappear. It raged above, in the trees, on the rooftops, along the frozen roads. But below, where the villagers had planted their courage in the soil, warmth returned, not just to their homes, but to their spirits. In Greiburg, the ground became more than a place to bury roots. It became the foundation of life. And for Elric, that small, dim, earthen room lit by a single flame and the steady breath of his family was not a fallback. It was the future. Quiet, strong, and deep. Let others seek shelter in stone towers or distant cities. The people of Greiburg had rediscovered an older truth. When all else fails, go to the ground not to fall, but to rise. When the sky turned white and silence fell heavy across the village, the center of every home pulsed with a single, flickering rhythm. The hearth. It wasn't simply a fire. It was a lifeline, a ritual, a sanctuary. And in Greiburg, it was sacred. Knelt by the hearth every morning before the sun even dared to rise. He didn't speak. He didn't rush. He coaxed the embers alive with reverence, as if asking permission from the fire to live another day. Amara would soon follow, her hands moving with quiet familiarity, adding dried roots to the pot, checking the coals, whispering small blessings under her breath. The children still slept nearby, bundled in thick quilts, their breath visible in the cold corners of the room. But the hearth, even in its earliest glow, promised that warmth was coming. This fire was not accidental. Its placement was strategic, the absolute center of the home, where heat could radiate evenly to every wall, every person, every task. Elric had rebuilt the stone base with a mason's care, lining it with rocks that held warmth long after the flames died down. It wasn't just a source of heat, it was an anchor for the entire house. And around this anchor, life unfolded with rhythm and meaning. By mid-morning, the hearth took on its second purpose, nourishment. Amara's pottage, a thick and endlessly evolving stew, never left the fire. It absorbed what the family had to offer each day: barley, onion skins, salted bones, dried legumes. There were no recipes, only instinct and necessity. What mattered wasn't how it tasted. It was that it filled the belly and gave strength. Every bite, every shared spoonful, was a quiet rebellion against the cold. Children, even in their innocence, understood the value of the pot. Lena once placed a wooden figure beside it, a crude carving of a woman with her hands outstretched. When Elric asked what it meant, she said, "She's thanking the fire for staying." No one moved it. The figure remained there the rest of the season, a silent guardian over the bubbling pot. But the hearth gave more than heat and food. It gave a place to gather. As the sun vanished each afternoon and frost crawled over windows like a slow disease, the family would circle the flames. No words were needed at first. Just presence, just breath. Eventually, someone would speak. Usually Elric, recounting stories from when he was young, or tales he'd heard from the old hunter who once wandered through Greiburg before vanishing into snow. There were stories of wolves with glowing eyes, of spirits that walked the woods only during blizzards, of a girl who sang to fire so sweetly it never went out. Sometimes the stories were nonsense, but in those moments, they were warmth in their own right. Not every flame crackled. Some stories burned quietly in the soul. Amara had her own rituals. Each night, she tied a small bundle of dried herbs and tossed it into the fire. Rosemary for remembrance, sage for health, lavender when the children were restless. The scent would drift upward and mix with the wood smoke, weaving a kind of invisible net over the room, calming even the worst of winter's teeth. Neighbors began to notice. One evening, an elderly widow named Isla knocked softly on their door. Her hearth had gone cold. The wood was wet, and her fire would not catch. Without a word, Elric walked over with a glowing coal cradled in a ceramic bowl. He knelt beside her hearth and breathed life into it. When it caught, Illa wept not for the flame, but for the reminder that she wasn't alone. That became a tradition. If your fire died, someone in the village brought you flame. Not out of pity, but as a promise. You didn't need to ask. Just hang a red cloth in your window and wait. The hearth also transformed how the village connected. With work impossible outdoors most afternoons, people visited each other more. They came bearing bits of bread, cured meat, dried mushrooms. In return, they received warmth and stories. Each hearth was different, some larger, some more primitive, but all were respected like altars. It wasn't impolite to sit in silence before someone's fire. It was expected. Sometimes words weren't necessary. Just being near the heart of another family was enough. Elric, ever the thinker, devised what he called stone cousins, small smooth rocks heated in the coals, then wrapped and placed in the children's bedding. Lena began naming them Ember, Coley, and Warmy. In the dark, when the wind screamed through the valley, those stones felt like the hands of friends, even after meals. When exhaustion pressed down, no one left the hearth without ritual. The family would each place a hand near the flame and whisper a single thing they were grateful for. Lena once said, "I'm glad Mama still sings when it's cold." Corwin said, "I'm glad we have soup." Elric said, "I'm glad you're here." That was the quiet miracle of the hearth. It wasn't just a tool for survival. It was a mirror, a healer, a place where connection warmed deeper than fire. The heart of Greiburg beat not in a church or a council hall, but in the center of every home, in the flames tended carefully, in the stories traded freely, in the silent moments shared between people who refused to face the cold alone. And in Elric's house, every evening ended the same way. He would stoke the fire gently, whisper to it like an old friend, and sit with his family close. As the last embers settled, the room held a peace that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the kind of warmth that even the harshest winter could not extinguish. Nightfall in Greiburg came like a closing fist. The sun did not set, it vanished, devoured by thick clouds and a creeping frost that wrapped the world in silence. And in that stillness, inside those earthbound cottages, families prepared not just for rest, but for the most critical act of survival: sleep. For Elric and Amara, sleep was no longer something passive. It was a strategy. Each night was a calculated attempt to keep heat from leaving their bodies, from drifting out through thin walls or cold floorboards, from being stolen by the breathless chill that pressed in from every angle. This wasn't just rest, it was a nightly battle against winter itself. Their sleeping arrangement began with a platform of tightly packed straw, refreshed each week, then layered with stitched wool blankets and animal hides. But the true brilliance lay in how they positioned themselves. They no longer slept side by side like modern families. They slept like a living organism, curved, interlocked, wrapped in a shared rhythm of breath and warmth. Corwin, the youngest, was always placed in the middle, where heat was most concentrated. Lena flanked him on one side, Amara on the other. Elric lay along the outer edge, like a sentry against the cold. His arms stretched behind Amara's back, not in comfort, but in guardianship. They all faced inward, shoulders curled, knees tucked. It was a configuration as old as firelight, one forgotten in modern life, but reborn out of necessity. But it wasn't just physical, it was emotional. In those sleeping circles, fear had no place to settle. A child could wake from a nightmare and, without words, press closer to a parent and feel steadiness through skin. Elric sometimes woke in the dark, unable to see anything, but hearing the slow breathing of his family, he knew they were safe, and he would sleep again. They called it the fire nest, but the villagers of Greiburg had many names for their sleeping places. The elder widow, Isla, called hers the hush bed. The mason Elric, who lived alone, had built a bed frame over heated stones and stuffed it with moss. He slept in a semi-reclined position with wool tied to his legs to reduce cramping. Everyone, no matter their age or household size, had found their own way to outwit the cold. What made these arrangements extraordinary was how adaptive they were. Elric noticed early on that the children became restless if they slept too flat, so he and Amara tilted the platform slightly, creating a slope that reduced airflow over their bodies and allowed heat to rise gently from the feet to the shoulders. They tested different angles until they found the one that left no one shivering come dawn. They added heat stones, small smooth rocks heated during the evening and wrapped in cloth. Each child received one, nestled near their stomach or feet. The stones cooled slowly, offering hours of comfort. It was a simple trick, but it changed everything. One night, as the wind howled louder than usual, and the walls creaked from the pressure of snow, the village bell rang. Someone's fire had gone out. Without hesitation, Elric rose from the bed, careful not to wake Corwin, and walked to the door. Before he left, Amara handed him a hot stone wrapped in leather. For her hands, she said softly. It was Frau Milda, an older woman whose hearth had failed. Elric handed her the stone and helped her restart her fire, but when he turned to leave, she asked him to wait. Stay a moment, she said, just until I fall asleep. And so he sat beside her bed, silent in the flicker of fresh flames, until her breathing settled into a slow rhythm. Only then did he return home. This was how Greiburg operated. At night, there were no strangers, only bodies, breath, and blankets, a shared fight against the elements. Even the way people woke had changed. There was no alarm, no sunlight pouring in. People rose based on temperature. When the air dipped too low, someone stirred, added wood to the hearth, adjusted blankets, rotated positions. Sleep was not linear. It was split first sleep, then a waking hour, then second sleep. In that middle time, people spoke in hushed voices, tended to chores, or simply reflected. Amara often used that hour to sew patches on clothing or recite lullabies to Corwin, who would wake half asleep, listen, and drift back off again. Elric sometimes carved symbols into the wood of their sleeping platforms, small runes of protection or blessings for warmth. They were half faith, half habit, but he believed in both equally. The children began making bedtime rituals of their own. Lena created a song, soft, repetitive, nothing more than a melody hummed in the dark. Corwin took to holding his sister's hand as he fell asleep, his thumb brushing her knuckle. These gestures, seemingly small, were enormous when warmth and connection became your only defense. One evening, a traveler arrived at the edge of the village, a man, disoriented, lost in the snow. He had nearly frozen. Elric and Amara took him in for the night. He did not speak much, only whispered, "I thought I'd die out there." They gave him a place near the hearth, offered him soup and warmth, but it was not until they wrapped him in furs and placed him beside Corwin that he wept. "I haven't been touched in weeks," he said. "I forgot what warmth felt like." He left 2 days later, but before he did, he said something that stuck with Elric for months. "Your beds, they hold more than heat, they hold kindness." And that was the truth of it. The genius of Greiburg's sleeping arrangements wasn't just the engineering, the angles, the strategies. It was the soul behind it. A village that refused to sleep apart, that made space for one another, that understood survival wasn't about endurance, it was about togetherness. In the coldest nights, when even the stars refused to shine, Greiburg slept not in fear, but in quiet, shared warmth. It wasn't just the fire that kept them alive, it was each other. Even as snow blanketed every road and forest path in a ghost-white silence, life stirred quietly underground in Greiburg, not in resistance to winter, but in concert with it. Elric, like his ancestors before him, understood a vital truth. To survive the cold, one must not only protect against nature, but learn from it. It began with the roots, quite literally. In the early days of frost, before the snow hardened the soil like stone, Elric and a handful of neighbors dug deep into the earth behind their homes, carving out large pits with rounded walls and tightly packed stone linings. These weren't ordinary cellars. They were life chambers, built not just to store food, but to read the language of the seasons. Elric called his, almost with reverence, the ground keep. Inside these pits, each vegetable had a place. Carrots, turnips, parsnips, and leeks weren't just tossed in together. They were organized by their resistance to cold, their moisture content, their tendency to sprout. It was a quiet science, not born in books, but in memory passed down. From mouths now long gone, from hands that no longer stirred the soil, Amara became the keeper of the keep. She learned to read vegetables like a mother reads a child's face. If the beets started to sweat, they needed more straw. If the carrots looked limp, the air was too dry. If sprouting began, she opened the top hatch for ventilation. No thermometer, just observation. Just instinct honed by survival. They used layers of hay like woolen blankets. One on the floor, another over each tier of vegetables, and a final one draped across the entire surface before sealing the hatch. When it snowed, they packed it on top. Not to keep the cold out, but to hold the right kind of cold in. Snow, with all its quiet hostility, became their ally. Its insulation kept temperatures inside the pit steady, even while the world outside froze solid. And it didn't stop there. Loic discovered something that surprised even the oldest men in the village. If he layered snow with hay alternating them like a sandwich, he could build an exterior mound around the pit that kept internal temps hovering just above freezing for weeks. He called it the cold cradle, and once word spread, every family tried their own version. They began using root vegetables as temperature indicators. Carrots were the first to give signs of danger. Too soft, too firm, a hint of frostbite on the tip. Each reaction was a message. They recorded these changes, mentally at first, then scratched into wood tablets hung by the pit entrance. What had started as survival was becoming a discipline. One late January morning, Corwin ran breathless into the house, holding a beet with a sprouted nub. "Mama, it's too warm," he said. Amara smiled and added another layer of straw that very night. The entire village soon followed a pattern of food rotation that mimicked the rhythm of the cold itself. Cold fronts meant moving the potatoes lower. Warmer days brought dried herbs and beans closer to the surface. They weren't just storing food, they were listening to it, responding to it. They developed what Amara called flavor waves, certain combinations of preserved goods that were best eaten in sequence before she paired salted beans with turnip slices on weeks when moisture levels were high. On dry weeks, she served barley pottage, laced with dried apples, rehydrated slowly in snowmelt. Every meal was more than nourishment. It was strategy. It was art. But preservation required more than clever placement. It demanded guardianship. The villagers began assigning frost keepers rotating duties among families to check on communal pits, especially during sharp cold snaps. If anyone neglected their turn, the penalty wasn't harsh but symbolic. A jar of pickled cabbage or a bundle of dried herbs donated to the community kitchen. It wasn't about punishment. It was about contribution, about reminding one another that winter survival belonged to everyone. Elric, ever curious, began to experiment. He buried sealed clay pots filled with honeyed pears deep in snowbanks, wrapped in birch bark and linen. 6 weeks later, he retrieved them and found the fruit, not only preserved but intensified, sweetened by the slow tension between cold and sugar. It became a kind of celebration, shared with neighbors like a reward for patience. Children were taught the signs of spoilage, not with fear, but wonder. They turned preservation into a game. Find the softest onion became a challenge. Spot the sprouting bean earned a prize, a hot stone to hold on their way to bed. And perhaps the strangest, yet bravest tradition was what they called the fool's bite. Each week, one adult would nibble a suspicious piece of food. It wasn't recklessness, it was commitment. If the bite passed, the batch lived on. If not, it was discarded. Once Elric took a bite from a questionable cabbage and spent a full day groaning near the hearth. Amara called him a fool, but also kissed his forehead and gave him extra broth that night. Sacrifice, in Greiburg, came with affection. What they built that winter wasn't just a food system. It was a relationship with earth, with decay, with timing. They didn't try to overpower nature, they partnered with it. And in doing so, they discovered that even in the deepest months of sleep, the earth still breathes, still offers, still waits by early March. As the first birds returned to the trees, and a wet thaw began to spread across the lower fields, Elric opened the final chamber of his storage pit. Inside, wrapped in straw and dry moss, were 2 perfect leeks and a jar of dried apples. He held them like treasure. Nature had not betrayed them, it had taught them. And in their listening, in their layering, in their timing, they had passed the test. They were still here, still warm, still fed. When the cold pressed into Greiburg like a living thing, when even breath felt heavy with frost and the wind sliced through the cracks in the world, the people didn't retreat, they adapted. And they did it with thread, with instinct, and with the kind of wisdom that doesn't come from books, but from centuries of survival etched into skin and memory. Elric had always thought of clothing as something passive, something worn. That winter, he learned it was something wielded. It became armor, a second skin, a silent battle cry against a season that demanded everything. It began with woolen washed, scratchy, still rich with lanolin. Amara insisted on keeping it raw, swearing that the oils trapped heat and pushed water away like a duck's feathers. Elric had doubted her at first. Then he stood outside during a sleet storm wearing one of her cloaks, and the water simply rolled off him, pooling at his feet, while his shoulders remained warm. He never questioned her again. Their layers were not random. The base layer was always thinnest woven wool, spun with nettle fibers that wicked away sweat but clung to warmth. It itched terribly, but Amara had a trick. She rubbed the inside with crushed juniper and dried rose petals, softening the contact and scenting the fabric. The middle layers were thicker, rougher, and designed not to move, but to trap heat. The outermost cloak was a masterpiece stitched from heavy felt, reinforced at the shoulders with overlapping scraps of leather, and lined with moss gathered from shaded cliffs behind the village. But fashion wasn't just about heat. It was about breath, about movement. They learned to dress in pieces that could open and close quickly, depending on wind or activity. Amara crafted what she called wind wings, triangular flaps that could be folded across the chest and tied beneath the arms. When the wind screamed down from the ridges, those wings turned the body into a tent, redirecting the chill like sails on a ship. Elric carved bone toggles for every fastening, big, easy to grip with cold fingers, and placed them along seams where the fabric was weakest. Not one stitch was decorative. Everything served a purpose. Their clothes did not flatter. They functioned, and in doing so, became beautiful in their own quiet way. Even their shoes told stories. Elric's boots were made from cured cowhide, wrapped in sheepskin, and tied with sinew. Inside, Amara had stuffed dried straw, herbs, and a layer of rabbit fur. The warmth was immediate and astonishing. Corwin once placed his bare foot into a boot fresh from the fire-warmed rack and gasped, as if he'd stepped into summer. "It feels like sunlight," he whispered, in the evenings. When work was done and the hearth still burned, Amara hosted what the village began calling wool circles. Neighbors would arrive, arms full of raw fleece, needles, thread. They sat in a great circle, not unlike the ones they slept in, spinning wool, mending sleeves, patching knees. The conversation flowed freely, sometimes quiet, sometimes full of laughter. The room would grow warmer by the hour, not just from the fire, but from the bodies, the breath, the shared rhythm of their hands. And always, the children were involved. Lena had become skilled at braiding wool strands into drawstrings and wrist ties. Corwin, too small for spinning wheels, was given a special job, tucking dried lavender into the seams of collars to fight lice and offer a faint, calming scent while they slept. Greiburg began to develop its own signature look. No 2 cloaks were the same, but every one bore signs of care. Some villagers carved their initials into the toggles, Others embroidered small symbols inside the sleeves: a leaf, a star, a flame meant to bring luck or protection. They weren't fashion statements, they were messages. Quiet declarations of identity in a world that had narrowed to snow and silence. Elric's cloak, made by Amara in the earliest days of frost, had a secret sewn into its lining, a small square of blue cloth from her childhood blanket. "So you always carry something warm from the past," she said. He didn't know how to respond to that, but when he wore it, he stood straighter. He walked into the wind without fear. The clothing didn't eliminate the cold. Nothing could. But it gave them a barrier, a breath of time, a buffer between skin and sky. And more than that, it gave them dignity. In the harshest conditions, when fingers cracked and cheeks bled from windburn, they could still look at one another and see effort, see care, see survival crafted stitch by stitch. On the coldest day of the year, when snow piled past the windows and the trees themselves groaned under the weight, Elric stepped outside at dawn to check the woodpile. As he stood, wrapped in 5 layers, he saw his breath curling into the frozen air like smoke from a quiet fire. And he thought not of suffering, not of cold, but of Amara's hands on the spinning wheel, of the children giggling as they hid lavender in their sleeves, of neighbors trading fleece-like currency of the soul. Their clothing was not only warmth, it was memory, it was proof. And as Elric turned back toward the glowing door of his home, he realized something profound. They weren't just surviving the winter, they were dressing for it like it was an old friend they knew how to meet. The night they brought the animals inside, something in the village changed. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the air itself. The way it moved, the way it breathed. In a season where every sound was muffled by snow and every shadow stretched longer than it should, the soft huffing of livestock became a kind of reassurance. It was as if nature, even in its harshest form, was offering companionship. For Elric, the decision wasn't made lightly. His cottage, dug into the ground and insulated with care, was already crowded with his family and the modest rhythms of winter life. But when a neighbor's calf was found frozen near the edge of the pasture, its eyes still open in a final, stunned moment of confusion, he understood the risk of separation. Warmth wasn't a luxury that could be hoarded anymore. It had to be shared, even across species. They began with the cow. She was old but loyal, named Marla, and she took to the change like it was her idea. Elric cleared a space in the far corner of the house, lined it with hay and a thick mat of straw, and built a low barrier of stones to contain her heat. Not to confine her, but to focus the warmth she produced. Within hours, the room felt different, less brittle, less sharp. Next came the goats, restless, mischievous, but generous with their body heat. Then a handful of hens, settled in small, woven baskets suspended from wooden beams. Finally, a woolly pig named Borst, whose grunts seemed to argue with the wind at night. It was chaos at first, feathers in the air, the smell of damp fur and manure pressing against the wood smoke. But over time, the sounds blended into something like a lullaby. Corwin adored the animals immediately. He spent evenings whispering stories to them as they chewed and blinked in the warm shadows. Lena, more reserved, was hesitant at first, but soon found comfort in the steady rise and fall of the cow's breath. Amara, ever practical, devised a daily routine of cleaning, feeding, and rotating the animals' positions to keep heat flowing evenly through the home. She even created a small flap of wool that hung between the animal zone and the sleeping area, just enough to trap the warmth, but still allow the scents and sounds of shared life to drift through. Elric observed the change, not just in temperature, but in spirit. The family laughed more. The children woke less at night, and most remarkably, the firewood pile lasted longer. With animals helping to heat the space, they burned fewer logs, extending their resources in a way that no one had expected. The science, though they didn't name it as such, was remarkable. Each animal became a living furnace, their body heat radiating into the room, their breath adding a kind of humidity that kept the air from becoming too dry. When combined with the warmth of the hearth and the insulation of earthen walls, the temperature in their home stabilized. Not warm by modern standards, but survivable, livable. Human. Other families in Greiburg followed suit. Each home adjusted according to its space and needs. Some brought in chickens only. Others created clever partitions to house multiple species. The smithy, whose forge was useless in the frost, repurposed his stone barn as a communal pen for villagers who couldn't house their animals. It became a warm, noisy sanctuary filled with wool, feathers, straw, and steam. There were rules, of course. Daily cleaning was essential, so was fresh straw. Children were assigned rotating tasks, collecting eggs, refilling hay, sweeping droppings into compost piles that now steamed softly in the corners of back gardens. The waste, once seen as something to be discarded, became fuel, literal and symbolic. Decomposing straw added to the warmth underfoot. Layers of ash were spread beneath the bedding to reduce odor and absorb moisture. They called it earth floor medicine. But beyond the strategy, there was an emotional layer no one had expected. The animals brought more than heat. They brought rhythm, sound, life. Elric recalled one evening when a storm rolled in fierce and sudden, snow blowing sideways, cracking trees. He and Amara sat silently, bracing for the roof to lift. But then came the low, steady exhale of Marla the cow, a sigh, long and deep, followed by the shuffle of hooves and a snort from Borst. The sounds reminded them they weren't alone. They weren't exposed. They were surrounded by beating hearts and steady breath, all joined in the same ancient effort to keep living. There were challenges, certainly. The scent of livestock never truly left the walls. Elric sometimes longed for the open air of summer, but what was gained far outweighed what was lost. The children no longer cried from cold. The nights no longer felt like waiting rooms for danger. And when the village gathered at twilight to share stories and soup, the talk turned less often to fear and more often to gratitude. In time, they began to track which animals produced the most warmth. Marla, with her thick winter coat and slow, steady breathing, was valued like treasure. Some families even bartered for warm animals, trading excess food or wool for a sleeping calf. It wasn't greed, it was calculation. It was planning and protection and survival. In the worst part of winter, when no birds sang and even the rivers seemed to hold their breath beneath the ice, Elric watched his son fall asleep curled up against the side of the pig. His face glowed in the firelight, peaceful, unaware of the storm that howled beyond the walls. And Elric thought then, not about the strangeness of animals sleeping indoors, but about the genius of it. About how, in the end, survival was not about pride or propriety. It was about recognizing warmth in every form it came, whether from a fire, a hand, or the gentle breath of a cow standing quietly in the corner of your home. That winter, the people of Greiburg didn't just stay alive, they lived with the wisdom to welcome all the warmth the world could offer, even when it wore hooves and feathers. In a world stripped bare by snow and silence, time did not simply pass, it carved itself into everything. The people of Greiburg learned quickly that winter was not just about enduring the cold. It was about mastering the clock, not the one that ticks on a wall, but the one that pulses through the land, the sun, and the body. Elric began noticing it first. A pattern, a rhythm, the way warmth crept into the house, not with the fire, but with the slant of the sun through the small, high window, a pale beam that landed on the same patch of floor every morning at exactly the same time. It didn't feel accidental. It felt like a sign. And from that point on, time was no longer invisible. It became visible and vital. He took a piece of charcoal and marked where the light touched each hour. It was crude, but it worked. Soon, he was measuring the length of shadows across the room and noting which days the light came sooner or later. He called it the subline, and from that line, their lives began to shift. They stopped living by instinct alone and began living by schedule. Not rigid, not artificial, but in alignment with what the earth offered. Every moment of daylight became precious, a currency too valuable to waste. The hours between 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, when the sun hung highest and strongest, were named the golden hours. Everything essential happened then. Firewood was chopped, storage pits were inspected, clothing was mended, food prepared in bulk. The village moved like a single machine, warm hands working in harmony. Afternoons were for gathering, not labor. As the sun lowered, the village knew to retreat indoors, to hoard the day's warmth in their walls and bodies. The transition wasn't abrupted, was ritual. Children rang a small bell. Women pulled heavy curtains. Men ensured the animals were secure. Then the twilight councils began. These twilight gatherings weren't just meetings. They were the heartbeat of the community. Inside the largest home, often Elric and Amara's, due to its central hearth and deep floor, dozens would gather. They sat close, not just to save heat, but to share it. Every body added warmth. Every story shared added something deeper. They spoke of food stores, of the health of elders, of upcoming snow. But they also sang, prayed, laughed. These councils weren't governance. They were survival through togetherness, and time governed even their sleep. It was no longer a single stretch of rest. It was split, wisely, naturally. First sleep came after nightfall, heavy and warm. Then a waking hour in the deep middle of the night, a time for stoking fires, for quiet reflection, for hushed conversations in the dark. Then second sleep, lighter, more peaceful. Their bodies adjusted. Their minds did too. They did not fight the rhythm, they joined it. Amara kept what she called the warmth ledger, a journal of when meals were eaten, when children grew restless, when the cold pressed hardest. She recorded which times of day the milk stayed warmest in its vessel, when boots dried best near the fire, when Corwin woke from dreams. Over time, this ledger became more than notes. It became a map, a guide. The next winter, they would be even better prepared. Even the children learned the language of time. Lena watched how quickly snow melted on the south-facing roof and knew it was nearly midday. Corwin used how long his shadow stretched across the wall to time chores. They didn't need clocks. They had the sun. They had snow. They had each other. And then there were the cold watchers, a group of villagers rotating in shifts whose job it was to monitor the drop in temperature as dusk approached. They watched how fast frost formed on clay pots left outside, how quickly water stilled in shallow bowls. If the signals came quickly, they would blow a horn, one long note through a ram's horn that echoed down the valley. It meant the cold was coming hard. Everyone indoors. Now no questions. Elric took his turn, like everyone else. He'd stand alone beneath the slate-gray sky, fingers numb, listening to the wind speak through the trees. It wasn't poetic, it was practical. He needed to know what the night intended, and some nights he could feel it before he saw it. The sudden silence of animals, the sharpness in his lungs, the way his breath fell heavy instead of light. But perhaps the most beautiful act of timekeeping in Greiburg was sunrise gratitude. Every morning, before the village stirred, one person would climb to the hill above the village to greet the first light. It rotated, young, old, anyone able. When the light broke the sky, they would return and knock softly on 3 doors. No words, just a knock. That was enough. It meant the sun had risen, that life had begun again. Amara said once that winter was not darkness. It was a different kind of light, one that asked you to look more closely, and Elric believed her. Because in learning to count the sun's hours, in learning to schedule survival down to the minute, They had not lost anything essential. They had found clarity. They had found power in rhythm. Time was no longer something passive. It was a tool, a weapon, a companion. And so, in Greiburg, they did not wait for spring with desperation. They waited with discipline, with maps drawn, in shadow and breath, with stories told by the hour and bread baked at just the right moment. They lived inside the ticking of fire and frost. Each second counted not in fear, but in purpose. By the time the snow began to melt, Elric had stopped counting the days. Winter had folded into their lives so completely that its passing felt less like a finish line and more like the slow, careful closing of a chapter written in breath and fire and silence. Greiburg thawed gradually. The frozen streams cracked open with a murmur, like waking after a long sleep. Mud replaced snow in the village paths. The wind softened, trading its sharp whistle for a gentler hum, and in the still cold soil, tiny green shoots reached for the sky, like fingers remembering how to stretch. Elric stood on the hillside above his home. Corwin perched on his shoulders, Lena at his side. They watched the morning sun spill across the valley. Smoke curled from every chimney. Life had not only returned, had endured, and standing there, surrounded by what they had built, Elric understood that survival had never been the real story. It had only been the beginning. That winter had tested everything, their strength, their knowledge, their compassion, but it had also revealed something deeper, the wisdom that lives not in books or sermons, but in doing, in digging, in giving, in daring to believe that ancient truths still held value. Elric thought of the earth womb, still packed tight beneath their home, its walls bearing the marks of their hands. He thought of the pottage that had fed them, day after day, not just with calories, but with comfort, of the nights tangled together in their fire nest, surrounded by the breath and weight of family, of Amara's fingers stained with wool and ash, crafting warmth from nothing, of Marla's breath steaming in the cold, of the candlelit councils, of the knock that signaled the first light had returned. These weren't just methods, they were moments, human moments, and in them lay a legacy that could not be written in stone, only passed through living. In the weeks that followed, as the frost receded into memory, Elric did something he had never done before. He wrote, not poetry, not confession, just a record of how they had survived, yes, but more importantly, of how they had lived. He wrote about sunlines and snow pits, about wind wings and nettle-threaded wool, about the way Amara hummed while she stirred the pot, and how Corwin whispered thank you to the pig that kept him warm. He wrote about time, how they had shaped it, honored it, about fire, how they had worshipped it without ever saying so, and about people, how they had held each other when no other warmth remained. Lena helped him bind the pages with twine. Corwin decorated the cover with a carved sun. They called it the Winter Book, and though it was humble, it was heavy with meaning. They gave it to the village not as a guide, but as a gift, something to hold when the next winter came, to remind them not just of what to do, but of who they had become years later. Long after the firewood from that season had burned to ash, people still spoke of that winter. They didn't call it the harshest. They called it the one that showed them who they really were. Children born after the frost would grow up sleeping on angled beds and sharing warmth with livestock. They would learn to read carrots like thermometers, to listen for the horn before dusk. But more than that, they would grow up believing that hardship was not something to fear, but something to meet, to shape, to survive with grace and grit and generosity. Elric never claimed to be a hero. He never sought recognition. He was just a man who wanted to keep his family warm. But through his choices, his care, his quiet persistence, he had built something no storm could erase, a way of living rooted in nature, community, and courage. One day, as Corwin approached manhood and asked his father what the hardest part of that winter had been, Elric paused before answering. He didn't speak of the cold, or the hunger, or the long nights. Instead, he said, the hardest part was trusting that what we knew was enough, and that was the truth of it. They hadn't had more than their ancestors. They hadn't invented fire, or the wheel, or warmth. But they had believed in what they'd inherited, and in doing so, they'd made something entirely new, something worth passing down. The frost returned, year after year. It always did, but now, it found a village ready, not fearless, but brave, not untouched, but unbroken, and in the heart of Greiburg, tucked into a shelf by the hearth, wrapped in wool and memory, the winter book remained, waiting for the next storm, waiting for the next hand to turn its pages and say, we are still here, still warm, still human. When the first snow fell over the village of Greiburg, it seemed harmless, soft, even beautiful, a whisper of winter, familiar and expected. But what came next was not just a season, it was a reckoning, a force that tested every assumption, every tradition, and every heart that beat beneath a thatched roof. And in the center of it all stood a man named Elric, an ordinary farmer with calloused hands and a quiet sense of duty, who would come to embody something just survival. But transformation. Elric was not born into greatness. He had no special tools, no secret knowledge. What he had was family Amara, steady and fierce in her care. Lena, wide-eyed and curious. Corwin, tender and full of questions. He had neighbors, not heroes or kings, but people like him, bound to each other by frozen earth and the shared rhythm of need. And he had memory, the kind passed down, not through books, but through gestures. The way his grandfather once patched a wall before the storm, the way his mother layered root vegetables for spring. As the cold deepened, Elric chose not to retreat but to dig. Beneath the surface, he found not only warmth, but wisdom. He lowered his home into the arms of the earth, transforming simple shelter into sanctuary. His hands cracked from frost, his back ached from labor, but with every scoop of soil, he reclaimed agency. The earth womb he built for his family wasn't just a place, it was a declaration. We will not break, we will learn, we will adapt. But digging was only the beginning. The hearth became their pulse. Fire no longer flickered just for comfort, it glowed with intention. Around it, pottage boiled, stories passed between generations, and silence became sacred. They didn't simply warm their bodies, there they rekindled hope. And with every meal shared, every whispered gratitude before sleep, Elric's family wove invisible threads between one another, the kind that no frost could sever. They slept like ancients, shoulder to shoulder, curved in warmth, hearts in sync. It wasn't elegant, it was real. Corwin would curl against Amara's side. Lena's fingers would find her father's wrist in the dark, and every morning they awoke, not in luxury, but in life. It wasn't survival by chance. It was survival by design. Then came the preservation, the pits carved from frozen soil, the vegetables arranged like chess pieces in a quiet war against time. Snow packed not to be shoveled, but harnessed, hay layered with precision, clay pots sealed with intention. Even waste was reimagined into fuel. Every motion was thought made visible. Every action bore the weight of knowledge honed by generations and sharpened by necessity. And yet, it wasn't just the hands of humans that kept them alive. Elric opened his door to the animals not because it was easy, but because it was right. The cow's breath warmed the air. The chicken's feathers softened the silence. The pig's snore became lullaby. Survival had no room for pride, only partnership. And that winter, warmth had hooves and fur and a heartbeat just like his own. Time itself became their compass. They measured not in hours, but in sunbeams, in shadows, in the way breath turned to fog by the window. Golden hours were harvested like crops. Sleep came in waves, in purposeful rhythm. There were no wasted moments, only rituals, only meaning, only grace carved out of minutes. And through it all, Elric wrote nothing until the frost broke. Then, and only then, Did he put words to parchment, capturing not what had happened, but who they had become? He wrote, not for fame, but for memory. The winter book was bound, not just in twine, but in love, in ash, in heat. When spring came, it didn't announce itself with fanfare. It came gently, in the soft drip of icicles, in the shy green pushing up from tired earth. And Elric, standing with his family beneath a sky no longer gray, saw the world not as something that had punished them, but something that had taught them. His story is not one of triumph in the grand sense. It is not about overcoming odds with grandeur or conquest. It is about choice, about the courage to stay, to dig deeper when others might flee, to learn when others might despair, to hold on to warmth in a world that seemed determined to take it away. So what is the lesson here? What does Elric's winter mean for us? In a world flooded with convenience, distracted by speed, dulled by noise, we are losing our relationship with resilience. We are told comfort is the goal, that struggle is failure. But Elric's winter tells a different truth. That hardship is not the end. It is the fire through which we are refined. That warmth means more when we create it together. That wisdom isn't always found in innovation, is found in the soil, in the shared bowl, in the breath of a child asleep beside you. It teaches us that when the world closes in, we must not harden. We must soften, draw closer, open our doors to warmth in whatever form it comes, whether from a neighbor's hand or the exhale of an old cow. And maybe, most of all, it teaches us to trust in the old ways, not to reject progress, but to remember that the answers we seek have often been whispered for centuries in the quiet rhythm of survival. So how can we apply this today? Maybe it's as simple as eating dinner by firelight instead of screen light. Maybe it's building something with your hands, or starting a garden, or inviting someone over instead of sending a text. Maybe it's teaching your children not just to want more, but to work with what they have. Maybe it's looking at discomfort not as a threat, but as a teacher. Maybe it's remembering that, like Elric, you are enough, not when everything is perfect, but especially when it isn't. Now I'd like to ask you something, and I genuinely want to hear your answer. If you were living in Greiburg during that winter, what would have been your greatest challenge? A. Facing the cold head-on with your family, adapting every day with limited resources. B. Letting go of comfort and modern convenience to fully embrace the ancient rhythms of survival. Comment below with A or B, and let's see what resonates most with our community. Your thoughts might inspire someone else to reflect differently, and that kind of shared insight is what this channel is all about. And if this story touched something inside you, if it made you feel, think, or simply pause, then please support this journey by subscribing to the channel. Every click, every comment, every shared moment is a fire we build together. It fuels the next story, the next truth, the next chance to remember what we're made of. Because winter always comes, but so does the warmth we create together.